Welcome, dear viewers, to another deep dive into the gritty realities of economic mismanagement here on your favorite economics commentary channel, where governments dance and economies burn to ashes in a grand display of ineptitude. Today, we are taking a trip over to Zambia, where we are witnessing a tragic collision of environmental catastrophe and financial chaos. If you thought Zambia's debt disaster was bad, strap yourselves in, because now Mother Nature is delivering the knockout punch. Ladies and gentlemen, get ready, because today's session is about to peel back layers of mismanagement, bad planning, and delayed action that have left a nation teetering on the edge of a full-fledged economic meltdown. And honestly, if it wasn't so tragic, it might pass off as prime political satire. But first, let's get to the spark lighting the economic dumpster fire, drought. And not just any drought. The worst drought in over a century. Folks, Zambia has been brought to its knees by extreme El Niño-induced droughts that have sent shockwaves throughout the country's economy. But that's not all. Let's dig into the core issues at play. Problems that have been exacerbated by poor governance, inadequate preparation, and a financial strategy so broken that even bailouts from the International Monetary Fund (IMF) seem like mere band-aids on a bullet wound. Now, buckle your seatbelts because things get worse before they get. No, they don't get better. The drought has wrecked Zambia's agriculture sector, an industry responsible for more than 60% of its working population and 1/3 of the nation's GDP. It's almost as if nature itself is conspiring to showcase the vulnerability of the government's economic management. Due to the drought, Zambia's leading staple crop, corn, was obliterated, output was slashed in half. What, then, does that mean for a population depending on corn for subsistence? Spiraling price hikes and severe shortages for families already struggling under economic burdens. And in case you hadn't predicted a vicious cycle, here's what we now have. Import costs soaring, pushing Zambia further into international trade imbalances. These are the microcosms of a disaster the size of Mount Kilimanjaro. When you decrease food output, you choke off not only domestic consumption but exports too, wiping off critical revenue for an economy already battered by debt. Take a closer look. Corn is a primary food source, but also a critical revenue driver. Cutting corn production by 50% means fewer supplies for hungry locals, fewer exports abroad, and a knock-on effect that we're only starting to unravel. It is no surprise that inflation has surged to highs not seen in 4 years, sending prices rocketing. This hits households, especially poor ones, harder than ever. Inflation is hovering near a frightening 4-year high. Basic food and commodities have become more of a luxury than a necessity for average households, with many families sacrificing even their fundamental needs. Zambia's inflation rate from June 2024 hit 20%, the highest in almost 4 years. And here we are waiting for President Hakainde Hichilema to tell us that this, too, is a highlight of poor governance predating his administration. And some of it is. Don't get me wrong, Zambia's problems didn't start last week. But boy, this administration has been too slow. Incompetence layered on top of inherited instability has been the formula to bring Zambia to the brink. So what triggered this inflation spike? Surging fuel and energy costs. With hydropower supplies crumbling, businesses are turning to diesel. And wow, diesel prices are surging by a whopping 16% in the first half of 2024 alone. Electricity outages as long as 24 hours. Let that sink in. We are not talking about inconveniences here, people. We are talking about a business sector that's almost at a standstill. Small businesses can't function, merchants can't trade, supply chains are broken, and the informal economy, which hundreds of thousands of Zambians rely on, is paralyzed. Farmers are unable to irrigate what little remains of their crops, further exacerbating food scarcities. Now, the knock-on effects of all of this, as homeless as they may sound in statistics, aren't too abstract for most Zambians. Consider the currency, the kwacha. In a span of months, the kwacha depreciated 11.3% against the dollar. Here's what that means in simple terms. Zambians are forced to pay even more for imported goods, including fuel and food, and the ugly cycle continues. Remember, when a government loses control of its currency, it loses control of nearly everything. Zambia needs power. Debt restructuring alone won't fill gas tanks or dampen electricity bills. Now, the astonishing part, Zambia is still emerging from a brutal debt restructuring deal. Folks, when I say staggering, imagine Zambia's financial books riddled with pages scribbled with the names of more creditors than can be counted. Earlier in 2024, Zambia was forced to restructure a monstrous $3.9 billion debt load. And while this may sound like a win on the surface, don't get your champagne flutes out just yet. You haven't heard the whole story. Under the dominance of foreign creditors and bondholders, debt restructuring means Zambia will now have payments as loans come due once again. Bondholders, they want returns, simple as that. Multilateral institutions like the IMF offered lifelines like a $388 million bailout, but you have to ask, at what cost? We've seen similar instances in the past, Sri Lanka, Argentina. Countries that are barely holding on because assistance often feels like exchanging one chain for another. Now we've got these entities like the IMF and the World Bank who've come in with an extra $140 million for catastrophe relief credits. However, Zambia's got to pay the new debt on top of restructuring old debt. A compounding problem for the average Zambian household and businesses alike. Sound familiar? Hint. Check out any case of historical desperation-linked loans and see yourself the mounting interest rates over the years following such deals. It's like buying your groceries on a credit card with 40% interest while your water pipes are cut off and your annual salary somehow keeps shrinking. Imagine this, 8 million Zambians on the edge of food insecurity, and all this IMF-linked financial acrobatics amounts to a government totally locked in one situation, a self-perpetuating debt crisis. Now, let's talk about Zambia's one gilded thorn amidst an economic bed of thistles. Its mining sector, more specifically, copper. Zambia is the second largest copper producer in Africa with huge potential for boosting GDP and foreign earnings with this resource. First Quantum Minerals Limited, one of the major operators, has miraculously overcome intermittent energy shortages by importing their own electricity, at a higher price, of course. But for one of Zambia's most valuable sectors, it was essential. Copper production was up order of 6.3% first half of 2024 compared to the same period last year. It's a statistic the government would love to tout, except for the fact you're about 3 copper mine output spikes away from easing the foundational pain of the agricultural demise, accelerating inflation, a weak sauce currency, and billions in outstanding foreign debts. Despite copper performing relatively well, this sector isn't Moses parting the Red Sea here. Transfer pricing scandals, revenue leaks, and historically poor taxation of the mining sectors significantly reduced the gains for state revenue. Leading us back to the original point, poor economic planning. Even when the government gets growth right, it doesn't fully translate to national well-being. So we've talked about debt, inflation, currency struggles, and now the crippling energy problem. There may not be a bigger sign of economic collapse than rolling blackouts lasting a whopping 24 hours. And this isn't just miscommunication or short-sightedness. It's a failure of investment into sufficient power generation infrastructure. Zambia had historically relied on hydropower to generate around 85% of its electricity. But with drought comes reduced water levels. And yes, you guessed it, power shortages. Zambia's hydropower capacity just hasn't been able to keep pace. The system nearly collapsed after struggling to function amidst low water reservoir levels. And now blackouts are common. So, how has this failure affected ordinary citizens and businesses? Just picture enterprising Zambian car wash stations doubling as phone charging centers, or customers, huddling around public outlets in malls, waiting for a mere flicker of electricity. Churches, where congregants now not only pray but fuel their devices via generator power. It's become nothing but farce. However, what's no joke is that economic productivity grinds to a halt. When hydro fails, what do you turn to? Fossil fuels. Yet diesel prices are skyrocketing, businesses are burdened, and inefficiency reigns supreme. Is it any wonder then that diesel consumption jumped 16% in the first half of 2024 alone? That's a direct consequence of businesses scrambling to keep their lights on, just as consumers are scrambling to keep phones charged. Yet, here's the bitter irony. Fossil fuels and expensive imports drive inflation even higher. Dependence on diesel for power means more inflation, and more inflation means fewer households can afford basic goods, exacerbating the already dire poverty levels. What does this all mean for economic growth? Well, projections for 2024 were recently revised down to 2.3%, and economists like Gibson Musumbu are already warning it could fall below 2%. This would be one of the worst growth rates Zambia has seen this century. To put that in perspective, Zambia's growth is almost flatlining, and with inflation soaring and debt pressures mounting, the economy is gasping for air. Zambia's debt situation is another perfect example of why balancing books while blindfolded is a bad idea. We talked earlier about the $3.9 billion debt restructuring deal, but let's go even deeper here. Zambia's total national debt, hovering around $32 billion, includes loans from China, Western banks, and international financial institutions. And let's not sugarcoat what loans from China mean. Chinese creditors have become masters of so-called debt trap diplomacy in Africa. Sure, they offer alluringly low-interest loans for infrastructure projects, but when the borrower inevitably fails to pay on time, heavy-handed negotiations lead to China taking control of key assets. Zambia, whose copper mines are the crown jewel of its economy, risks losing control over precisely these kinds of strategic assets. Most of Zambia's debt is denominated in US dollars, meaning when the kwacha depreciates, like the 11% drop seen this year, it becomes even harder to pay down these loans. It's like trying to pay off student loans with a shrinking paycheck. The government has to devote more and more of its resources just to keep up with mounting interest payments and principal repayments. When doing so, little is left for essential areas like infrastructure, healthcare, education, or even disaster relief for drought-stricken regions. Without a thorough and sustainable debt strategy, Zambia's economy, like many other sub-Saharan African nations trapped in debt restructuring, will never break free from this debt spiral. Each new bailout from the IMF or the World Bank may provide temporary relief, but the nation remains stuck in a perpetual cycle of dependency. And dependency means policy decisions become more dictated by international financiers than by the Zambian people or their leaders. More upsetting is that after years of debt accumulation and fiscal mismanagement by previous governments, Zambia has essentially mortgaged its future. Future generations of Zambians will be paying for the mistakes of today's policymakers, a disheartening reality if corrective measures are not taken soon. Now, here's the kicker. Politicians are experts at finding a narrative that suits their agenda, and President Hakainde Hichilema is no exception. When he declared the drought a national disaster in February 2024, many expected a strong coordinated response to address both the agricultural collapse and the subsequent economic fallout. Yet, months later, we see mostly a juggling act of crisis mismanagement, taking funds from the IMF and World Bank as short-term solutions, while doing little to tackle long-term problems like sustainable farming, diversified energy infrastructure, or debt reduction. When asked about the ongoing calamity, Finance Minister Sitambiko Muzokatwain will likely point to Zambia's copper sector as the beacon of hope. Yes, copper production was up 6.3% in the first half of 2024, but blaming the drought or global economic downturn only goes so far. The truth is Zambia's economy has been skirting dangerous waters long before this drought hit. What we see now is the delayed consequences of years of structural vulnerabilities ignored by successive Zambian administrations. Politicians are quick to deflect blame, claiming global economic headwinds, emphasize droughts, or blaming their predecessors. While some of these factors are outside of the government's control, there's no avoiding the dire need to address the weaknesses within Zambia's internal economic system. Droughts may be unavoidable, but a cohesive economic strategy can mitigate their impacts. And yet, one can't help but observe. Where is the planning? Where are tangible investments in irrigation technologies, renewable energy projects, or economic diversification? This brings us to a critical aspect of the Zambian economy that has haunted it for decades: lack of diversification. This narrative has been discussed widely. Zambia's over-reliance on a handful of sectors, primarily copper, leaves it extraordinarily vulnerable to external shocks, be it in commodity prices or climate disasters like the ongoing drought. At the peak of the global commodities boom in the mid-2000s, many resource-dependent nations like Zambia fueled their economies with the returns from high copper prices. But copper, just like oil and other commodities, experiences significant price volatility. Zambia failed to adequately prepare for the inevitable downturns, leaving itself vulnerable once global copper prices stagnate or decline. High fluctuations are already evident in copper trading prices, which earlier in 2024 saw a decline from record prices due to weaker demand from major importers like China. As copper prices tumble, so do Zambia's key tax revenues. Where was the economic planning to diversify into value-added industries? When copper mines inevitably undergo downturns, even temporarily, the reverberations affect millions, from the workers themselves to the businesses dependent on cash flow from mining paychecks. It is a sad reality that even today, Zambia's economy is just a copper strike away from destabilization. Agriculture could have been a powerful buffer against this volatility, but the government failed to diversify and reduce dependence on favorable weather patterns. Sustainable agriculture could drive employment, export revenue, and food security. Yet the terrible drought in 2024 starkly exposed the vulnerabilities even in this sector, another victim of short-term thinking and adverse climate events. Alright, so let's try to find the bright spots, or at least the perceived ones the government wants you to believe exist. The copper mining industry still offers potential, and international investment is trickling into some sectors. Though output in the copper sector increased by 6.3% in early 2024, simply hoping that copper will be Zambia's ticket to prosperity isn't a realistic solution. The industry remains capital-intensive, meaning growth in the sector doesn't always create massive employment opportunities for Zambia's rapidly growing population. Mining companies like First Quantum Minerals Limited are investing heavily in expansion despite the challenges of expensive power imports and energy shortages. With higher demand for copper due to its vital role in electric vehicles and renewable energy systems, Zambia's copper could serve as a source of revenue to be reinvested into the economy. But again, only if the revenue is managed prudently. Unfortunately, Zambia's history of mismanaged resources doesn't inspire much confidence. Some may point to multilateral support as a silver lining. The bailout strategies of the IMF, the World Bank, and other institutions have temporarily eased the catastrophic collapse that Zambia would have faced without it. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, these aren't long-term solutions. They are brief lifeboats keeping you afloat in stormy seas. What happens when the bailout funds run dry, and Zambia has to return to the markets to finance its debts? The reality is clear. Silver linings only last as long as policymakers can find innovative, sustainable solutions, and those must include economic diversification, debt management, sustainable energy infrastructure, alternative agriculture improvements, and most importantly, an overall realization that long-term planning trumps short-term crisis solutions. So here we are, at the end of this critical journey into Zambia's economic quagmire. Is there a way out? Absolutely. But it's not simple and it's nowhere near easy. Here are a few critical strategies that Zambia needs to implement if it wants to even think about economic recovery. 1. Diversify the economy beyond copper. Zambia can no longer afford to rely solely on its copper sector. Agricultural modernization, agro-processing, and tapping into new industries like tourism, technology, or light manufacturing must be embraced. Zambia's youth population is a potential driver of innovation, so education and skill development in newer industries are crucial. 2. Climate-resilient agricultural investments. Climate change is an undeniable reality. Zambia must invest in irrigation technologies, drought-resistant crops, and better farming practices to withstand future droughts and disasters. With the global population rising, food production will always be demand-driven. Prioritizing sectors that cater to domestic needs and export opportunities could ensure future income streams. 3. Energy independence through renewables. Droughts have highlighted the limits of reliance on hydropower, especially as Africa's climate becomes further destabilized by global warming. Zambia needs a solid investment in solar energy, wind power, or even geothermal energy to ensure energy security in the coming years, while reducing its debilitating dependence on imported fuel and diesel. 4. Debt sustainability. Though the government has managed to secure debt restructuring, its fiscal policies need more transparency and sustainability for long-term recovery. Zambia needs to negotiate better terms with its creditors, especially China, and maintain strict financial discipline. Debt audits and fiscal consolidation efforts should be a priority, ensuring that public funds are utilized effectively without waste. This means curbing corruption, enhancing governance, and building a competent economic framework. Debt restructuring should be paired with fiscal reforms aimed at reducing the deficit and streamlining government spending. The last thing Zambia needs is to keep accumulating more loans to service previous loans, a classic recipe for debt dependency. Moreover, focusing on domestic revenue generation rather than relying on external borrowing will be key. Tax reforms, including better taxation of the mining industry, can help generate the capital needed for investments in infrastructure and services. 5. Strengthening institutional accountability. One of the reasons Zambia finds itself in this mess is poor governance and lack of accountability in managing public resources. Overhauling public finance management by ensuring that funds are not diverted into corrupt schemes or under-the-table deals is critical. Strengthening anti-corruption agencies and making them independent from political pressures can prevent the rampant mismanagement of resources that has characterized past administrations. Institutional transparency needs to be a top-down effort to ensure developmental aid and loans truly serve the intended purpose, benefiting the general population rather than lining the pockets of a few elites. 6. Investment in human capital. As part of its long-term strategy, Zambia must focus heavily on education, healthcare, and vocational training to cultivate a skilled workforce capable of adapting to the demands of a modern, diversified economy. Investing in human capital will ensure that Zambia's youth has the skills to compete in newer sectors such as technology, alternative energy, and services. When we consider Zambia's challenges in electricity, for example, we realize that technical solutions, like expanding renewables, need qualified engineers, project managers, and infrastructure experts. Boosting technical education and vocational training ensures that the country isn't reliant on imported expertise for every major upgrade in infrastructure. 7. Regional cooperation and trade. Zambia sits in a prime geographical location in southern Africa, and the nation should look to leverage this position for mutual benefit through regional trade agreements and infrastructure projects that promote cross-border trade. Encouraging its manufacturing sector and exporting finished products or value-added goods by utilizing trade benefits from the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, could be a game-changer. Collaboration with neighboring countries to build inter-country energy grids, transportation corridors, and trade routes can reduce reliance on fractured local systems. Additionally, Zambia should enhance its ability to export electricity to neighboring countries once its production stabilizes. Regional infrastructure development, such as railways, roads, and trade linkages connecting mines to ports, will increase economic activity and reduce costs for local businesses. At this stage, we must not overlook the broader context. Zambia's economic crisis, amplified by the worst drought in over 100 years, is a harbinger of what is to come in many sub-Saharan African, SSA nations. Zambia is far from alone. From Ghana and Kenya to Ethiopia and Mozambique, we see a familiar story of soaring debt, climatic challenges, and fiscal mismanagement. The SSA region was hit hard during the COVID-19 pandemic due to reduced economic activity, lower commodity prices, and rising costs for basic imports. These economic pressures suffocated growth just as some of these nations were beginning to make headway in their developmental agendas. To mitigate the fallout, many countries, like Zambia, resorted to borrowing sums greater than they could manage, hoping that post-pandemic rebounds would somehow allow them to recover funds quickly, a strategy that has now backfired. The sad reality? Zambia is the epitome of what happens when commodity dependence, poor fiscal discipline, and climate instability converge in an already fragile economy. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate-related shocks, as its economies are heavily reliant on agriculture and natural resources. The drought in Zambia is not a one-off. It is a warning about how climate change can upend economic prospects and send nations spiraling. International institutions like the IMF and World Bank are aware of the ticking debt bomb across Africa. But throwing lifelines every now and then with bailout packages isn't the appropriate solution. What Zambia has shown the world is the importance of building economic resilience, both from internal mismanagement and external factors like global commodity price shifts or climate calamities. Zambia's situation presents a cocktail of complex, overlapping crises requiring parallel track solutions that address both short-term needs and long-term restructuring. From agriculture collapse to hydropower shortages and debt overhang, this is a nation wrestling with emergencies while also needing structural reform for future stability. Tackling problems individually simply isn't enough anymore. Zambia's leaders face a significant challenge. They must move past the political spin and provide clarity on how to manage endemic inflation, stabilize the currency, and ensure long-term food security. Politicians love to blame the environment, international commodity markets, or their predecessors for tough situations. But at the end of the day, clear and effective policy reforms are the path to economic stability. Time has come for President Hakainde Hichilema's government to stop using quick fixes like temporary IMF loans or debt restructuring to bandage festering wounds. Zambia's future health, both economic and environmental, depends on a multi-pronged approach that combines sound fiscal management, structural reforms, and investment in sustainable industries. The government must start thinking in terms of self-sufficiency, ensuring that Zambia can weather storms like droughts without requiring recurring international bailouts. Zambia has valuable mineral resources, a youthful population, and a pivotal geographic position within Africa. Yet those advantages will amount to little if systemic problems continue to go unaddressed. It is not just policymakers who must step up. Zambian citizens themselves will need to hold their government accountable in ways more effective than they have in the past. Protests, democratic engagement, and civil society advocacy should focus on ensuring that external loans and domestic resources are used transparently and efficiently. Without grassroots pressure, the risk of policy stagnation remains high. Investing in the future. Will international assistance be enough? Though international institutions have played an essential role in saving Zambia from financial catastrophe, the question remains: how much longer can external funding sustain Zambia? The IMF, World Bank, and other multilateral partners need to focus not just on providing funds but ensuring that Zambia, and other similarly debt-ridden nations, have robust financial governance measures in place. Zambia cannot continue to survive on credit. The loans themselves are becoming part of the problem. Long-term strategies of self-reliance and domestic resource mobilization are key to ensuring that Zambia can stand on its own and plan for its economic prosperity without being held hostage by creditors every few years. The wealth generated from copper mining and the enhancement of agricultural output offer pathways toward this. But for that to happen, Zambia needs not just financial capital, but capacity-building initiatives supported through international cooperation and technology transfer agreements, helping Zambia transform itself into an economy that thrives in both natural and human resources. As the global conversation moves toward climate resilience, Zambia must lead by example and incorporate sustainability into its national planning. If the recent drought is a precursor of what's to come, then Zambia must develop infrastructure resistant to climate shifts and ensure that its food production systems, energy sector, and water management frameworks are climate resilient. This should open the door to international climate financing, but only if Zambia demonstrates a credible commitment to climate-friendly policies and robust governance. Zambia's struggle is nothing short of a stark warning to the rest of sub-Saharan Africa. Poor economic planning, susceptibility to external debt, and unchecked reliance on singular sectors like mining or agriculture will always lead to crises in the face of external shocks. Zambia's combination of economic calamity from a century-long drought and runaway fiscal mismanagement has thrust it into an abyss, but it is not without hope. If Zambia recalibrates its priorities toward fiscal responsibility, economic diversification, energy resilience, and climate adaptation, it has the chance to turn itself around. Crucial alliances with international financial bodies may provide temporary relief, but real solutions will come from long-term, sustained structural reforms. Zambia's young, dynamic population and its wealth of natural resources do offer potential, but they hinge on Zambia's ability to manage its economy with discipline and foresight. The clock is ticking, and as nations around the world watch Zambia from afar, hoping it emerges victorious, one thing is clear: Zambia's downturn may foreshadow what's to come for other similarly positioned economies. For the sake of Zambia's future generations, and potentially Africa's as a whole, now is the time to act. This can be Zambia's moment of reform or its moment of downfall. Only time will tell.